Welcome. My name is Tony Goodman, and I am host of PlaceCast, a series discussing insights into everything about places across the UK, and especially what makes a happy, successful place that people want to visit. With guests from industry, academia, government, including influencers, decision makers, practitioners, and other experts, we will be exploring best practice to identify the latest trends and directions. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this edition of PlaceCast, where we talk about what makes a happy, successful place. And I'm delighted to be joined for this edition by one of the most interesting council officers in the country, Sean Anstee, from the Devon and Torbay Combined Authority. I've known Sean for a long time, since he was my councillor in Trafford in the Bowden ward, and he became the youngest council leader at the age of 26 for Trafford Council. So with his both combined political and administrative viewpoint, as well as you will hear, an academic viewpoint, I'm looking forward very much to this discussion. Sean, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Can I ask you, first of all, to expand on that and just fill in a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a very kind introduction, and the Devon and Torbay Combined Authority was created just over 15 months ago, and the opportunity arose to be the authority's Director of Operations, so responsible from its inception for mobilisation, for standing up the authority, for creating its policy and performance framework, for thinking now as we move into delivery on a range of different functions, for example, around transport, strategic planning, adult skills, and economic development and growth, to try and build an authority in a part of the country that hasn't benefited from devolution in the past in the way that perhaps big urban city conurbations in the UK have, and to do that from the very beginning. And so it's been very interesting 15 months. I'm sure we'll talk about it. And as you alluded to in your introduction, a sort of fairly eclectic history in different roles across local government, including in elected positions. And so hopefully able to bring a perspective that sort of transcends both what our politicians are thinking about, but also the way in which you then go and deliver policy as a result of that.
And just to quickly pick up on two aspects of that, because you talked about elected politicians and devolution. Famously, you stood for Mayor of Greater Manchester a few years ago, and whilst you didn't win, you were subsequently given a role by the winning mayor. Do you know what happened to him?
Well, the winning mayor, of course, was Andy Burnham, and we will see in the weeks and months ahead not just what happened to him, but also what happens next. And that election was 9 years ago now, so almost a decade. But it was a very civil contest, and civility in political life and discourse is something that we should all ascribe to.
And the fact that he rated you highly enough to give you a position involving his administration is significant. And that raises another question. How do you now operate across the divide of politics? Because, of course, as a council officer, you are apolitical, but there are elected politicians that are involved that have different agendas. How does your role accommodate those different agendas? But more importantly, what have you brought across and learnt from your role as a council leader, and what also have you had to unlearn?
Well, Tony, I think if you go back to the very creation of the first combined authority in Greater Manchester, which the combined authority, which is a product of, or at the time in GM was a product of 20, 30 years worth of collaboration between the local authorities of Greater Manchester, and therefore that sort of collective endeavour that could be combined into a separate institution that was then responsible for a range of devolved functions, was built on pretty solid foundations, and the application of that combined authority model to different areas has presented different challenges, because what you're effectively trying to do is to, as the word says in the title, is to combine different local authorities, different politicians and political parties into a collective endeavour across a range of strategic functions. So there's, as I've alluded to, transport, housing, economic growth and adult skills, for example. And I think, therefore, the approach that needs to be taken is to try and anchor people on common ground. I mean, my experience as a former local politician is that, we each had political views and every individual was entitled to their political views, but often you could find areas of agreement because nobody really disagrees that they want to improve the transport infrastructure of an area, they want to see jobs created, they want to see prosperity. The debate often is in how you do that. But the end outcome is often where you are able to anchor people into agreement. I think what's interesting from my perspective now, having lived in that world, to switching onto the other side, to providing advice to members, impartial advice to members, regardless and irrespective of the political party that they belong, is that advice needs to recognise the fact that members are taking decisions in a political environment, and therefore presenting a range of credible options that could be considered, but is part of a sort of wider, coherent sort of strategic whole, I think is really, really is the key to this, because taking an individual decision or viewing an individual decision in isolation of any others that may need to be made may at that particular point in time provide a political or geographic advantage to an individual local authority or to an individual community or area. But really, there's a sequence into decisions that says, where are we trying to get to? So in Devon and Torbay, we spent a lot of time in the first sort of 9 months of the authority being created, really saying, well, what is this? How are we going to create a solid foundation for this authority to deliver on its aims and objectives? What are those aims and objectives? And what will be different in 10 years' time as a result of the authority being here? And you can then work backwards with members about what the decisions that are required along the way. And going through that process doesn't always solve the party politics. Partisan politics is a characteristic of our local and national politics, but it does help to try and bind people together in the way that combined authorities were originally envisioned to be. And it's doing it in places that perhaps historically haven't had the same levels of collaboration and cohesiveness that you've seen, that had been seen in Greater Manchester over the last 30 or 40 years. And then I think, just in terms of what I've learned and unlearned, I mean, what I've learned is that, the most important thing in any of this, whether you're an officer or an elected member, is a willingness to make something happen. That willingness is often intangible, but if you believe and get behind backing something to change, you can make that change occur. And then clearly now in the role that I have, as you've alluded to, is, it's a very different way of working for me. I now need to, as I said, present those options, take those decisions and then implement them.
You talk about the comparison with Greater Manchester to Devon and Torbay. And one of the obvious differences is that Greater Manchester is a series of primarily urban areas and heavily industrial areas, where you said that the councils had been working together for some time. Devon and Torbay is physically different to that and is quite a large territory. What additional challenges does that bring, and particularly with the divergence between urban and rural within it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to consider. When I moved to Devon, just out of interest, really, I sort of had a look at the land mass of this county, and I think you can fit Greater London into Devon 4 times over and still have space remaining. Like, if you to visualize the size of the county, as opposed to the sort of more tightly defined and constrained urban constructs of Greater Manchester, Greater London, the West Midlands, and so on. So I think they present different challenges, but also different opportunities. So when we produced our local growth plan last year, that described the Devon and Torbay economy, and arguably Plymouth as well, as a £25 billion economy that is comparable to the size of Cambridgeshire, larger than the size of Bristol, larger than the size of Glasgow. Economic recovery in Devon post-pandemic has been at a rate 3 times the UK average. If you look at the sort of priority jobs that are identified in the industrial strategy, a quarter of all those jobs in the top 8 sectors are already located in Devon, Plymouth and Torbay. And so there is an opportunity on a sort of rural, coastal and urban basis to be able to try and change the narrative about what people think about the economic contribution, which is a pretty serious contribution that places like Devon and Torbay can make to the national growth mission. I think that the challenges are more around identity. In rural and coastal communities where the geography is so vast, I live in North Devon now. North Devon views itself very much as a distinct part of Devon. If you're in Torbay and you talk about the Bay, also a distinct part. You've got the urban centres of Exeter and Plymouth. You have the peninsula and the relationship with Cornwall, and so there is a requirement, I think, to be able to make sure that when we're talking about communities and places, we are respecting what are, many, many years and decades of identity that has been formed over that period. And when we talk about devolution, this is not necessarily just about concentrating power in the combined authority. If there's ways of being able, we've got lots of towns and parish councils. There's over 400 of them in Devon and Torbay, so they understand their communities particularly well. And so there's a challenge of engagement. There's a challenge of identity, but there is a massive opportunity. And the last thing I think I just said on that. Often in this debate, since the Greater Manchester arrangements were put in place 10 years ago, and other parts of the country, not just in Devon and Torbay, but in so the rest of the country, they also look to say, well, how can we achieve what Greater Manchester has achieved? How can we be like Greater Manchester? And that's I don't think that's necessarily the right question to be asking. The question is, what are the assets that are in each individual place, and how do you apply some of the lessons from Greater Manchester to those places so that you can grow? So in our context, we know that we have bedrock sectors in tourism, in hospitality, in construction, health and social care, but we also know that in strategically important sectors to the country, food security, renewable energy security with renewable and offshore wind, and with defence of the realm, and with Devonport and so on, that the contribution that Devon and Torbay can make is immense, and the advantage of trying to enter into sort of devolved arrangements is that we can elevate our voice not just across to our communities, but elevate it out on the national and international stage too. And if we get that right, that's when you then start to see the assets of an individual place being amplified, and you accelerate the improvements for communities across our patch.
It's interesting you talk, because you talk about this just now, and it's clear that when the Combined Authority started, you effectively had a blank sheet of paper, and you're talking about how do you conduct an academic exercise into defining what the role and what the priorities of that Combined Authority are going to be. And that's illustrative. But that brings me to another one of the arrows in your quiver, one of the things that you do that makes it very interesting. So you were the keynote speaker at the recent Institute of Place Management Symposium. And part of the reason for that is that you are heavily involved in Manchester Metropolitan University, where the Institute of Place Management is based. So, and it was a it was a broad-ranging and very well received keynote speech that you gave. I was fortunate enough to be there. Talk to us about how and why you got involved with the university, what your role has been there, and how your thinking was in approaching that keynote speech.
Well, I mean, so the first part of your question, Tony, I think is, I have a very strong view that higher education, universities are anchor institutions that have a very close association with the places in which they're located, but their ability to be able to come up with reasoned, evidence-based, well thought through propositions that can influence and change the dynamic of the policy debate that we have in this country, I think is hugely powerful and shouldn't be underestimated. And so when the opportunity arose to join the board of Manchester Met in 2019, it was one that I wanted to take with joy, really, because, you know, to be able to sort of see an institution like Manchester Met, and arguably other universities will think the same of their own, that is making such a powerful contribution locally in the city in which it's based, regionally, and how it influences nationally and internationally, undertaking pioneering research, really thinking about the challenges that we face today. We often talk about challenges, but you've got to turn them into opportunities. Any challenge should be an opportunity. And I think Manchester Met does an excellent job at doing that. And arguably, the hosting the Institute of Place Management is an example of it. I mean, there's how places interact, how they operate, how different communities. When we talk about place, we should also think about community. Not just the physical geography or physical location, but also communities that come together around a shared set of values or who they are and how they behave. And the way that all of that knits together in a way that, people always talk about successful places when they see them, not necessarily about how you create them. And so what I wanted to try and do when we were speaking at the symposium is to think about, well, what is the psychology of place, and what do we mean when we think about it, so that we, and we just alluded to earlier in our conversation, actually, if you take a large geography like Devon that has many places and many communities, we can start to think about how civil and public society engages with those places, and arguably how the private sector engages with those places when they create jobs. And so there's so many different dynamics and variables that are always at play, and everybody has and is entitled to an opinion on them. But I think if we can ground our opinions in reasoned debate, in evidence and in data, that helps us to try and get to better outcomes. And ultimately, my job at the moment is to both, I think is to try and understand what is the theoretical sort of construct behind this thing, and then how do you turn that into deliverable policy that makes a difference. And we often go back to some of those sort of staple things around transport, housing, jobs, the economy, but there's also things around culture, around arts, around history, around and all of that makes up what people view as the place that they live and belong. And that, I thought being able to hear from others on that day as well was hugely powerful, because it helps inform my thinking too.
Yes, completely agree. And one of the things you alluded to there is actually the main theme of PlaceCast, which is what makes a happy place, and by happy being a cipher for successful, place that people want to go, want to visit, or have as their local centre and want to use. So with the thought that you've clearly given to this, and your examinations, both from your time in Greater Manchester and your time now in Devon and Torbay, what do you think makes a happy place?
Well, I think, just take a step back, I think the two things that are on my mind around how do places succeed, one is through reinvention, and the second is through belief. If you look at the journey that Manchester city centre has been on over the last 4 or 5 decades, and the same is true in other city centres now, where people often write off places as if to say they will never return and can never come back. But places never stand still. So they're constantly reinventing themselves to evolve into either the desires and wishes of their community or their economy or their industries that are around them. And then the second thing, as I said, is that belief. And I think that partly goes to specifically answer the question, which is what makes a happy place is, one is people who believe in it, people who enjoy being there, who are not prepared to accept that your job lot is as it is, but that there is, places never stand still, as I say. So they have to, you have to constantly, I think, want to have a desire where what is right for an individual set of people and businesses, and these things around the geography, there's things around location. The other thing is about places are happy when they're beside other happy places. So there's issues I think it sort of spreads across there's an infectious enthusiasm about places that are successful, which then imparts on the neighbouring areas. So I think that's how obviously you want good jobs and all the things you'd expect me to say, but it's about belief, it's about confidence, it's about a very clear view about the contribution that a individual area is making to a sort of wider set of communities and places, and being comfortable with that would be my take on it, because that allows you to sort of grow things over time and to make sure that people feel pride. Pride is a big thing in this, isn't it? Are you proud of where you're from and where you're going? Are you proud of your history? And so if you look at it more from a sort of psychological lens rather than a sort of just physical assets, does it have a leisure centre? Does it have good shops? Whatever. I think the two things need to go hand in hand. Of course, it needs all of those, good infrastructure and good social, but good physical capital, but it also needs good social capital at the same time. And those two things together, I think, are a significant contributor to a happy place.
It's interesting. When you mention belief, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is Ted Lasso, whose motto is belief, and made a very popular show out of it. So it's going on the right track. If we go back to your time in Trafford, and one of the other things that you were saying, one of the very notable reinventions was around Altrincham, which is of which your ward was part, and was part of is a important town within Trafford. Now, for those that don't know, Altrincham had a market given by Royal Charter for 750 years. But perhaps you can talk us through the thoughts around why Altrincham needed reinvention and how that was gone about.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say on Altrincham is there was a huge effort from a great number of people prior to my time in Trafford and beyond to see it sort of revived. I mean, it needed it because if you think about the discussion that we've just had, Tony, around this was a place that was viewed in terminal decline. I think it was described as a ghost town, and that almost the stasis that had set in was this will never change. And yet, the great success story, I think, about Altrincham is the simplicity of its revival, which was to look at its history and to look at its pride and to bring that back. And that, focusing renewal and revival around the market hall, thinking about the public realm, thinking about the contribution that everybody who had a stake in Altrincham could make. So that sort of convening of landowners, of the public sector, private sector businesses, to turn around and not accept that just because something is going backwards, that always has to be in reverse. But there could be, using its history, using its assets, that you could reinvent it. And in this case, you've almost reinvented its past and made it present for the future. And I think that's what the great thing about the Altrincham story is, because it worked for the things that it had around it. It's got the communities of Hale Barnes, Bowden, Timperley, Oldfield, Brow. You could argue a little bit of Sale. These are strong communities that wanted to see their town revived. So that's great. had its market history, great. It had investment in public realm, great. It had a set of landlords that were prepared to do something. So that clinical responsible exploitation of those assets to give Altrincham its future rather than live in its past, I think is the great story of Altrincham as a place, actually, and its revival that we've seen now. And but it didn't happen overnight. The benefits are there for people to see. It just took a little bit of long-term vision, as I said, across a variety of different leaders of the council and different political members, but a desire to make it happen too as well. And I think that is a fantastic example of how places can revive themselves.
Absolutely. And for those that don't know, Altrincham is often used as a case study for reinvention. So it's very interesting to hear that from your role at the centre of it, or at least part of that journey, which of course is a microcosm in terms of the history of Altrincham and the history of the market.
Yeah.
You also mentioned Pride in Place, and obviously the Pride in Place movement is becoming stronger. Pride in Place requires, or generally accepted, that it requires strong local involvement. Where that reinvention is needed, how are you now setting about ensuring that the right circumstances are in place for that to make progress and to work? How do you go about enabling it?
Well, I think the Pride in Place programme has some very noble aims at the start of it, which is clearly trying to use funding to bring together those interested parties to look at the assets and strengths of individual areas and to make them work. I think it's important that as funding is provided, that it isn't just a case of distributing it on individual or unconnected ideas. It might be some public realm improvement, it might be improving fascias on shop fronts, whatever it might be. But for areas to take the time, a bit like as we've just discussed and described in Altrincham, to say, well, okay, so what are the assets of this area? What is its history? What do we want its future to be? And therefore, how do you use the financial power that comes with Pride in Place to make that happen? Because so I suppose what I'm saying is it's just about strategic decision making. Really, it's just really thinking about, as opposed to running off and doing individual things that may on their own have an incremental or marginal improvement. What's the whole thing that you're trying to do with an area, and how do you bring that together so that people are all pulling in the same direction? Because that's one of the hardest things, is to try and get people to pull together in the same direction and getting people to coalesce around the same things, which takes us back to our first point about combined authorities, which is where are the points of common agreement? How do you anchor people onto common ground? And that way you can make sure that the impact that the Pride in Place movement can have will be far greater than it otherwise would be if it was just a sort of individual set of funding decisions, as opposed to some serious thinking about the contribution of a place that it can make to its residents and businesses.
And what's your yardstick for measuring the success of such programs? What do you think that you need to see from them that helps you understand whether they're going in the right direction, whether they've achieved their aims, and so on?
So I think this is one of the most defining and challenging questions to answer, because it places about tangible and intangible things. Tangible things on, occupancy levels, how frequent the bus is, how late, what the nighttime economy is like, what the daytime economy is like. You can measure outputs, but what you often struggle to measure is sentiment and feeling, and that often follows the sort of more tangible indicators that are measured. And I think one of the roles of the sort of place management, place leadership sector is to try and define a little bit more about how are we tracking sentiment? What are the things that, because when people used to talk about Altrincham before its revival, they would talk about it using negative phrases. I think if you did a word cloud on Altrincham now, they probably would contain positive phrases. That is tangible, that is difference that you can describe, but it's still intangible, and it goes down to individual feeling. So I think, we're certainly going through a process at the moment of just looking at how we're going to measure the impact and success of the combined authority across all of its things, and what is the balance between those specific measurable outputs versus intangible sentiment. And you need both in order to be able to see progress happening. I think the only other thing that I would reflect on here, Tony, is you do need to pick a horse and back it to a certain extent. You can't sort of waver at the first piece of criticism, and there was ample criticism throughout the sort of the changes that were made in Altrincham, whether it was market traders who'd been around for a very long time or whatever, and nobody was saying that those businesses were not valuable, but that if you want to see a place change, you do have to take some decisions, and then you have to have the resolve to see it through. And that's, in the context of the role that I have today, my job is to provide advice to members that allows them to take decisions and then hopefully see through things over a period of time. And we live in a sort of society that wants to see results tomorrow or yesterday. And that's not always possible. I mean, there's a patience to this, which the political system doesn't always value, but it does value it once you get to the point where everybody feels happy. And you never quite know when you get to that point. But when people sort of turn around and say, I'm happy now, then you sort of know you've made it. But it takes a resolve to get there.
Yeah, and historically, a lot of people felt that, well, if you can just increase footfall, you've got the answer. I've talked before to other guests on PlaceCast and had this discussion with you, that footfall alone is not the right measure. It's having the right people there who are going to stay, who are going to hopefully spend, who are going to enjoy, who are going to partake. What you don't want is people who are just walking through and not engaging. So one of the measures that you could say is part of that measuring success and judging the sentiment and feeling is, well, what are the engagement measures, engagement levels? How many people are sticking around, whether it be to have a coffee or to do some shopping or use the other facilities that are now on the high street? And that brings me to another radical change in the world since you first became a councillor all those years ago. The high street at one time was strictly retail. It was full of shops. Now it's very much increasingly about food and beverage, hospitality, but also bringing more and more medical facilities into the high street, bringing the services to where the people are, but also having completely different types. I mean, there never used to be gyms on the high street. There are now. And there's a whole series of what might be called alternative uses for premises on the high street and indeed the high street itself. How do you feel that's being reflected in Devon and Torbay? Are you affected as much by that as perhaps more metropolitan areas, other areas in the country? What do you feel about the future of that and the direction that the high street is going?
Well, that question I think is being posed because it's obvious, isn't it? We're living in an increasingly digitalized, automated world where, how people shop and the movements that they make has completely changed over. The rate and pace of change is accelerating as every year progresses. So the way I frame this in my mind is around, is it a transactional visit to a high street, or is it an experiential one? And what do what is it that populations and cohorts of people are after? And I think increasingly it's about experiences, because the transaction you can do online, the experience you need to have connection, other people, things that bind you together. And my view on that, and I might be wrong, might be right, is that is just going to keep that polarization between the two will just continue to accelerate. People have a debate all the time about whether banks still need to be on the high street. I can't remember the last time I went into a bank high street. I do all of my banking on an app. But if I want to go and see somebody, I want to experience being with other individuals and other friends and family. You want places to do that in an experiential way. So that I think high streets that are able to understand that, I think, are able to respond to it. And in our context, as a part of the country where tourism is very strong, people come here to sort of visit Devon, visit the Southwest Peninsula. That just means that our high streets need to respond to that demand, but it also means that from a public policy perspective, we need to grow the working age population in Devon. And if we don't do that, by 2033, I think it is, the dominant age group in this part of the world will be the over 65s. So there's a whole sort of set of how do we reverse the decline of the working age population in this part of the world so that we can still support our high streets and create jobs and all of the other associated benefits with it. So, but as I said, at its purest form, I think it's about experiences versus transactions. And I think when I think about it, putting it in that context just helps me to try and think about what the future of the high street might be like.
And one of the biggest challenges with what you've just mentioned of working age population is always property prices. Yeah. The cost of housing, whether it be rented or to buy. How are you approaching that dilemma? Because on the one hand, you've got an economy that has a substantial part of its income coming from tourism. On the other, you want to increase that part of the aspect that needs housing available, and that's a fundamental dilemma. How do you approach that problem and decide where the balance should lie?
Well, one of the things that the Combined Authority is about to be responsible for is strategic planning and thinking about the infrastructure needs of what is as yet to be a defined geography, but thinking about infrastructure needs, at least in Devon and Torbay, thinking about housing needs, and so on. It'll be a statutory planning document, and there's a couple of ways you can approach this. And again, sort of learning from experiences in Greater Manchester when the spatial framework was put forward was, do you want to have a sort of quite dry conversation about allocations of employment and housing land, or do you want to have a more place-based conversation, which is, what do you want the future of our part of the world to be? What are the industries of the future? What are the sectors that we're seeking to promote? As I said, around farming, around farming and food, energy, defence, very important sectors to us. Photonics in Torbay, high precision engineering, and so on. Versus complementing that against our bedrock sectors of health and social care, construction, and so on. And so the approach I think that we're going to try and take with this plan is to be more ambitious and to tell more of a story around how you can get the requirements of a strategic plan, so land allocation and so on, but to try and sort of work with members and with the wider sort of community and places to think from an asset base and positively on what the future of Devon might be like, Devon and Torbay might be like, so that we can try and put in place the plan that would allow us to answer some of those longer term challenges around affordability of housing, some of which is extremely acute in parts of the county. And we will never be able to grow our working age population unless we have affordable homes. So there's a whole set of interconnected policy propositions that need to be thought about as we go through that process. And
what sort of timescales are you looking at on that? I mean, what's the horizon you're looking to in order to at least start making those changes, or to see some of those changes come about?
Well, every area of the country will have, in whatever geography it's been defined, will have a requirement to produce a plan by the end of Parliament, and that plan then 2029 is the present Parliament is, and then and it will look forward sort of 20, 25 years to then set out what those longer term economic and infrastructure ambitions will be. So, as I said, what could be a very dry planning process really needs to be thinking about, well, what does our local growth plan say about our growth sectors and about our population and the types of things that we want to see? So what are the metrics that we put behind it around population growth, affordability of housing, accessibility of transport, the types of jobs and the value of those jobs that are created? And then how do you strategically plan for that from an infrastructure and housing perspective? That's ultimately the equation that we're about to come up with. And I think it's one of the most important things that the combined authority will be doing. And it's also one of the advantages that being a combined authority has, because we're unencumbered with the services that councils provide. They're very, very important services in relation to social care, children's social care, parks, waste maintenance, all that sort of stuff. But our job is to concentrate on the strategic decisions that are required to get Devon and Torbay to where we want it to be, and this will be a mechanism that we can use to do it, and we need to approach it in a very place-based and oriented way.
So another topic I wanted to discuss with you that we've already mentioned briefly is the value of tourism to the economy. And I've spoken to other guests on PlaceCast about the dilemma that you have in this area between satisfying the needs of local residents and the demand for increased tourism, and how you accommodate both without losing either.
Well, I mean, tourism is a hugely important, as you've said, Tony, it's hugely important to the Devon and Torbay economy. Over 33,000 jobs directly depend on it across Devon and Torbay. It makes a significant contribution to our overall GVA. And I would tackle that, I think, by saying that the two can go hand in hand with each other, because the ability to be able to attract people to what is a very lovely part of the world to showcase it doesn't necessarily have to be at odds with people who live here. And what are the benefits of tourism? Well, how can we use tourism to be able to so what is a very seasonal economy in Devon and Torbay, how do you use that to have year-round benefits for people who are here all the time? So that might be in improved and more frequent bus services. It might be in being able to, as I said, if we're capturing spend and having that to support local businesses, and that's positive. So there's I'm probably less certain on answering this question, I think, but it is. But I don't think it's necessarily a binary. Tourists are bad, people who are here are good, or vice versa. But there is a way of being able to use tourism as what we describe as a bedrock part of our economy, in a way that can try and get year-round changes for people who live here. And let's try and tackle some of the adverse effects of tourism. So whether it's around house prices and others, by thinking about, well, what is the, as we just discussed, like when we're thinking about how many new homes do we need and how affordable they are, what are the arrangements that need to be put in place so that people feel they can benefit from being in an area that people come to live and visit.
And as you mentioned, it's about balance, and balance is important in fact, balance has flowed through everything you've talked about today, from the need to balance in your current role the different political views of the elected members that you're dealing with, through to balancing the requirements of visitors and people living in the area. Where do you see those balances going wrong, not just in your area, but nationally? What would you like to see addressed from central government that would help you in your job create a better environment?
Well, I think there's probably two sides to it. I mean, I'm a pragmatist at heart, which is probably what is coming through. So I think not only is there balance, but then the second side of that equation is around a decision. Once you've weighed up the facts and you've decided what members have decided what to do, there is then a responsibility to take the decision and for officers to go and implement it. I think where I would, so you then sort of that leads you to ask a question around, well, what is required to be able to make that happen? Well, first of all, there's something around as much as possible sort of stability in our decision-making environments. There is certainty and longer-term certainty around sort of our structures and how they sort of work and interact with each other. And so I think in order to be able to get to a balanced decision that looks at the trade-offs, you need to, it's not just a case of I would like this or I'd like that. I mean, it's for each place to decide what it thinks its trade-offs are going to be. Because what they are in Devon and Torbay will be very different to what they are in Hull and East Yorkshire, for example, or in the North East. So therefore, I think I go to what is the environment that's required to take a balanced decision, and to ask members to take a balanced decision. And I think that's about certainty, stability. It's about competence and confidence, and therefore to try and, I suppose, indirectly answer the question, what's the role of government in that? The role of government in that is making that happen. So from our perspective, here in Devon and Torbay, we are at the beginning of the devolution story. We're a foundation, non-mayoral strategic authority. Foundation authorities are intended to be stepping stones onto mayoral and then established mayoral authorities, where you get an integrated settlement. You can have more flexibility with the funding that you have. And so, it's important from our perspective that we start this authority well, that we scale it well, that we deliver against our sort of transport, strategic planning and adult skills plans, so that we can, I think government giving areas more freedom, because the debate about devolution is always, is it devolution or delegation? And clearly delegation, we still have a lot of reporting and back into central government, versus true devolution, which is completely trusting and empowering an area to do things for itself and accepting that some areas will succeed and some areas will not. And therefore, what do you do to try and make that happen? And I think that's the debate, probably where we need to get to, not just in Devon and Torbay, but elsewhere, is, set us free to be able to do some of these things. And then that should, we've seen elsewhere in the big cities, at least, that there is now tangible and empirical evidence and data that suggests that those areas that have got devolved decision making are closer to their communities, are able to make better, more informed decisions, and generally make decisions that last, which I think takes you full circle to balanced decisions that can be implemented.
Fascinating view of where we are in the world at the moment. As our time is drawing to a close, I want you to reflect back from 10 years forward. So let's take us to 2036. And what would you like to be able to look back on and say that you and Devon and Torbay have been able to achieve over the previous decade, from 2026 to 2036?
Well, look, I think if we can make progress, tangible progress, on the ambitions of our growth plan, on the working age population, on getting recognition of the contribution that the Devon and Torbay economy makes to the country, if we can grow the size of our economy, if we can be an environment where, it's almost like Altrincham, where, people talk permanently about the favourable things, the favourable aspects of being here, and not just its challenges, then I think that will put us in we will have been able to demonstrate that devolution in its present form has had a profoundly positive impact on the lives and well-being of people and communities across Devon and Torbay, and to be able to play a part of that, as we've talked about throughout the last sort of 40 minutes or so, Tony, is to it will be a great sort of personal sense of pride, and then we've got places that are thriving and succeeding. So giving it confidence, changing the narrative a bit, and having its contribution recognised equally in the same way that cities are, I think would be the way that I would look back and go, yes, we've made it work.
Sean Anstee, thank you for a fascinating discussion, and good luck with the future.
Thank you very much.